Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Scdawah Live. And we're discussing an interesting question about science and God today. And with me is Hamza Sotzis and the Canadian brother Sadat. Assalamu alaikum, guys.
Wa alaikum
Walaikum salam.
assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
So this question is very interesting because it's quite normal for atheists to actually say, give me evidence for God, give me scientific evidence for God. And if you can't provide scientific evidence for God, then God doesn't exist. And, it's almost taken, I would say, granted that it should be science which should be explaining God's existence or disproving God's existence. And also the way that this question is framed is, it's sort of, if you accept the premise that science is the way of looking at the world, then it puts you in a very difficult situation. There's many layers here that we can actually uncover when it comes to this particular question. So I want to get into the thick of it. So Hamza, when you get someone saying, well, I don't believe in God unless you can scientifically prove to me that God exists, how do you respond to that?
Well, firstly, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Jazakallah for having me and giving me the opportunity to share some ideas. May Allah bless every single one of you. And our beloved brother Sadat, very good to see him. May Allah bless him and his family and grant him and his family the best in this life and the akhirah. And you as well, Sabur Bhai. Very good to see all of you. And keep growing your hair, bro. It's really good. So basically, the first thing I would address with regards to this situation is really unpack the assumption that he's coming to us with, because he's really assuming that the only way to form conclusions about the world and reality is via the scientific method. And with all due respect, so many beliefs that he would believe to be absolutely true or true to a certain epistemic level will be thrown into the epistemic dustbin for life based on that kind of scientism, because that's what it really is. It's a form of scientism, which is that the only way to form conclusions about the world and the reality is through the scientific method. So interestingly, you have certain things that science requires, which are not really provable by science. For example, science has an assumption that nature is uniform that cannot really be proven by the scientific method, because the scientific method requires it in order for science to function effectively. Also, another philosophical assumption that science has is that you have some form of causal connections. Now, we're not talking about the nature of the causal link, because there's lots of ikhtilaf, difference of opinion in Western metaphysics on the nature of the causal link. We leave that to them to try and decide and iron that out. But the point is, science has to believe in some kind of external causal connection. That is a metaphysical reality. You have to adopt that in order to understand reality, not the other way around, generally speaking, but there's more to unpack, but the point remains. What about mathematical truths? You need some logical mathematical truths that cannot be proven scientifically. You need them before you do any science in the first place. So the question itself is fundamentally self-defeating. It actually goes against the kind of epistemic grain. It goes against what we actually know to be true that's outside of the scientific domain. What about historical truths, for God's sake? Yeah, what are you going to do with that? You're going to throw Plato and Aristotle in the bin? God forbid. Yeah. So the point I'm trying to say here is I would unpack the assumption. That's the first thing.
Brilliant.
The second thing I would say is, well, what do you mean by science? Please, can you define me what you mean by science, right? Science can be argued to have a demarcation problem to a certain degree. Are you saying the type of science, which is now the mainstream science, that they say that science is predicated upon methodological naturalism? What is methodological naturalism? Methodological naturalism is basically the view that for any scientific conclusion to be scientific, it cannot refer to any divine activity or power. Now, this doesn't deny God. It just says, well, if you want it to be scientific, if your conclusion is scientific, it has to really refer to physical phenomena. It can't refer to any metaphysical explanation. This doesn't deny God, though. To deny God using that would not be methodological naturalism. That would be philosophical naturalism, which is something distinct and different. Although,
sorry, just before you continue, admin, if you could please share the link that I sent you, because I think you're definitely giving an overview of the topic. But if you could just, before we get into it in a lot more detail, if you can just give us a little bit of an explanation about what is the Sapience Institute and why this book, which is definitely a must read for the topic that we're discussing today. Why people need to download this book?
Oh, this is a bit of a surprise. By the way, I did not tell the brothers to do this yet. Just letting you know. Okay, so basically, I wrote this book. This is the newly revised edition of The Divine Reality, God, Islam, and the Mirage of Atheism. And it was designed for those who are not really yet in depth in the academic arena concerning philosophy. So it takes them on a journey. And it goes through the truth of Islamic theism and the mirage of atheism. And it goes through things like the proof of the prophethood of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It goes through the miracle of the Quran, the linguistic miracle. It goes through arguments for God's existence, responses to academic and popular atheistic contentions. It goes through actually the topic that we're talking today. The chapter is basically on, does science lead to atheism? And it actually addresses that in detail, and it unpacks four kind of false assumptions that are adopted by some, not all, some atheists that make the claim that science leads to atheism. So yeah, you can download it. You can go to the Sapience Institute website, sapienseinstitute.org/books. You could download The Divine Reality and other books, and even Muhammad Hijab's book for free. Just give us your email and you get it for free. And you could read it and be empowered, inshallah. Sapience Institute, what it's about, very simple. We are focused and dedicated on developing and empowering Muslims to be able to share Islam intellectually and academically. There's great work going on, lots of beautiful institutes, beautiful brothers doing great work, but we felt there's a little bit of a gap in the market, if you like, and that gap is we need to create more of Sadats. Yeah, if I had 1,000 Sadats, and I'm not saying this to throw dust in his face, it's just for an encouragement, not just him but his wife as well, a great person calling people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I've met them in Canada, beautiful family, man, Allah bless them. That's what we need. We need 1,000 saburs, right? If you want to create a chaos in the universe, we need 1,000 saburs.
Yes, I would agree
you
with
get
that.
the point, my dear brothers and sisters. It's time now that we adopt a methodology of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's good to firefight, it's good to provide answers, but we really need to empower and transform Muslims to be able to be like these beautiful brothers that we mentioned, and even better. Because if we're really sincere to this message, we want to create people that are better than us, that could take the message further,
Absolutely.
and really touch, move, and inspire
Yeah.
people. And that's what Sapience is all about. And that's it.
Yeah. On that topic, I think on the topic of great brothers, Shabir Yusuf is going to be joining us within about half an hour roughly. Yusuf Ponders, who's also part of Sapience Institute, is going to be joining us. Before we get back into why this topic is important, could you just quickly go over who is the team in terms of Sapience, very briefly, because obviously this team can definitely tackle the topic that we're discussing today.
Okay, well, first thing, the wider team is everybody, all the du'at and all the Muslims. So we have an approach where you could take us to account, you can give us feedback, you can get involved. It's all open arms, okay? So that's the wider team. It's everybody. The specific team at the moment, and inshallah it will grow. Whoever wants to get involved, please get involved. Email us at info@sapienseinstitute.org. The specific team is myself, Brother Muhammad Hijab, Dr. Uthman Latif, who's a postdoctoral researcher in dehumanization and other fields, and he's been published by Springer and Brill. He's one of our best academics that we have in the West, in my view, especially concerning history and dehumanization and otherization and those type of topics. So we have Dr. Uthman Latif, we have Sabur Ahmed, we have Imran Hussein, we have Yusuf Ponders, beautiful brother. He just wrote for us a 17,000 word or so mammoth of an essay on nihilism part 1. It's already up. We haven't promoted it yet. I'm actually got a meeting after this, I believe, to do the marketing so we can promote it tomorrow. It's a great essay. Go to the sapiensinstitute.org website, read Yusuf's essay. It's phenomenal on nihilism. He's becoming a master in that field. May Allah bless him and preserve him. We have Mohammed Idrisi, who is a chef from a Darul Uloom graduate. He's in Spain. He's a great da'i in Spain, in Seville. He does a lot of our Spanish work. We have Bilal Tonyalu, who's now growing the Turkish aspects of Sapience Institute with some translations, and who'll be doing other work as well. We have Jamie Turner, who I think now is a PhD student now, and he's focusing on a kind of Ibn Taymiyan type of approach to epistemology, and he's got some great work concerning rationality and naturalism and self-evident truths and so on and so forth. We have Adnan Rashid, who has got a course coming up, I think in the next couple of weeks, on the Trinity itself. He's doing a paper on the Trinity from a historical perspective, that the early church fathers, basically, they didn't have, a conception of the Trinity from the point of view that the three persons of the Trinity are co-equal and co-eternal. They never had that in the first 3 centuries, and so on and so forth. Who else? Who's missing?
Before we go to who's missing, and I'm a bit worried that we have a few guests who've joined us, and I want to go to them directly, and then we can go back to some of the things that we didn't complete.
Yeah, for
earlier.
sure. I didn't want to really talk about this, but you asked me questions.
No. I mean, whenever we have guests on, we obviously go over what institute they're from and what they do. So I'm going to go first to Adam, and I'm just going to relay what Adam said to us in the comment section. So he relies on science for truths and for truths on religion/philosophy for his beliefs. There are exceptions, but this is his general rule. So welcome, Adam, to Scdawah Live. Firstly, tell us where you're calling in from.
Yes. Hello, guys. I'm calling in from the United States of America. So it's nice to meet you guys. So first, I would like to start with, it's not that science is the only way to prove truths. The question is whether science can prove the existence of God. And of course, this isn't to say that, and if it can, it's not to say that there are not other means of proving God, such as personal spiritual experiences, etc. We can't verify them because obviously we can't experience the experiences of others. However, they could still be means for discovering truths about God. So I think that science currently, because science is as you guys know, you've obviously studied the philosophy of science, it's constantly changing. And with the advent of technology, which I'll get into later, things become possible with science that aren't possible now. Currently, I do not think that science can prove God, but I do think that in the future it is possible. So first, I give it these are things that I've written down, but one example is how in the past, maybe even going 300 years in the past and before, humans were not able to detect atoms. So basically atoms were something, if you told someone that you think atoms exist, then you would be believing that, right? There's no way to prove atoms exist. Due to what? Due to their size difference, right? They're relatively small compared to our size. However, they existed all this time. So, and then I give another example of how radiation is undetectable to human senses, even though we know it exists, because we have new technology that can detect it, like thermal radiation. So from this, we can induce that there are existences which are undetectable by our senses, and that with new technology could become detectable. So this is from induction. This is an argument from induction that I make. And I believe there are other existences, like I said, which are not detectable by our senses, because if we've discovered some already, I would be foolish to think there aren't others, right, in the future. However, this only means that right now science can't prove these future discoveries. However, this doesn't mean that science won't or can't. So it is possible that in sometime in the future, we will be able to somehow detect God, through the advent of new technology.
Thank you, Adam, for giving your perspective, and I especially like how you've made a interesting inductive argument there, based upon science's success. So, Hamza, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'd like to thank Adam for coming on board. I know sometimes it can be quite, a bit scary joining a panel and speaking in public. I think there was a study that showed that people feared public speaking more than death. So Adam has overcome death to some degree. So I'm really happy that he came on board and wants to engage. I think that's, well done. I'm quite happy about that. So that's really good. So Adam, that's a really good perspective. Now, interesting perspective. Now, what I would say is this, Adam, is I think there's a slight kind of hidden metaphysical assumption in your discussion. And the hidden metaphysical assumption is that yes, it's true from a kind of methodological perspective that science is based on induction, that there can be always another observation that contradicts our current conclusions, and therefore science can change. Even Richard Dawkins, in his book The Devil's Chaplain, he talks about Darwinism as an explanation for biological change, and he says Darwinism, we may reject it in the future or give it up altogether or change it beyond recognition because of the beauty of science, and we admit this is the beauty of science, because you could have another observation or more data that actually contradicts our current conclusions that was based on limited data. That's one of the limitations of science, but at the same time, it's one of its beauties. So I agree with you on that 100%. That's why science can't lead to certainty. However, there is a little bit of problem when you apply this to the kind of theism, atheism discussion. The reason I'm saying this is because you would have to assume that God, by definition, is an observed reality that is contingent, that you can test. For example, even if you had, as you gave the example of the atom, that we never discovered atoms, but now we've discovered them from an empirical perspective. So therefore it gives us, access to a new realm of observation. The point here, there is a metaphysical presupposition here of empiricism, that all knowledge can be derived through sense experience. That is the problem, because when it comes to God, as defined by the monotheistic traditions, as defined by the Islamic tradition, God is transcendent. In the Quran, God says, "Laysa kamithlihi shay." There is nothing like his example. Some people mistranslate this as there's nothing like him, but it really means nothing like his mithal, nothing like his example, which is like a rhetorical emphasis to show you can't even make something equal to his example, forget directly God himself. So we believe God is transcendent and is not a contingent. What does contingent mean? Contingent basically means that it was possible for it to have not existed. Its fundamental building blocks could have been arranged in a different way. And it also means that it has limited physical qualities, and those limitations do not give rise themselves. There is an external set of factors that give rise to those limitations. All of scientific phenomena, all of empirical phenomena are within the realm of a contingent reality. Now, the question of God is, we need to prove God that is a non-contingent reality. In other words, is a necessary being, is a transcendent being. That's a different kettle of fish. So all science can do is actually keep silent on the topic. It can't really directly deny God's existence by definition, because its methodology and its presumed metaphysic, in terms of what you've just discussed, just cannot deal with the topic, because it can only deal with observed physical phenomena that have limited physical qualities, namely that they're a contingent, but God is a non-contingent reality. So, as in Islamic tradition, in all the schools of creed, God is referred to as wajib al-wujud, the necessary existing. So that's the first point I want to raise to you. The second point I want to raise to you, that if you want to develop a kind of argument that uses scientific evidence, fair enough, you may be able to do that. However, it won't be scientific anymore. It's what you call in philosophy an evidential argument. So an evidential argument can be of two types in this context. An evidential argument can use empirical data, scientific conclusions and data to philosophize. So you have to use a philosophy, you have to philosophize over, rationalize over, in order to either prove or disprove God's existence. But that would not be a scientific conclusion by definition, yeah? It would be an evidential argument. So I'm not saying you can't have evidential arguments for and against God, but you definitely can't have a scientific conclusion for or against God in terms of his existence by virtue of what I've just discussed. I hope that is that clarifies in some sense.
So can I respond to that?
Of course,
yeah.
So just one thing is, I think it's interesting how we say, science can only prove the physical world, and it's as if we place this arbitrary line between physical and metaphysical. And I think I think that line is always changing, because in history they would have considered anything which they can't see metaphysical. But now we know that because we've expanded our understanding of the world, we know that that's not the case, that there are things which we can't see that are not metaphysical, which lie in the physical world. So I think this line will always be pushed back. And I think you are right that I think this line will end just before proving God. However, because I know in the Islamic tradition there are, you guys believe in angels and other metaphysical beings besides God. So these we say they're metaphysical. Why? Do they exist within the universe? I think you guys, from what I know, yes. So, although we may not be able to prove God using science, maybe the line will be pushed back far enough, right? This is a metaphorical line. It's enough to where we can prove the existence of other metaphysical beings, which would point towards a God, right?
That's a very, 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 very nuanced and deep point. It means you've thought about it quite well. Sorry, will you continue or
Yeah.
did you stop there? I do apologize.
So this was just the first response. You can, if you want, like
Okay,
you
good.
can you can.
No, I actually agree with you. So in terms of the realm of metaphysics, agree. So for example, science doesn't necessarily, it's not the case that science can't deal with all metaphysical notions. Of course not. Because for example, the beginning of the universe can be argued to be a metaphysical notion, and it's something that science is actually starting to deal with based on the empirical data they have at hand. But I want you to change the kind of distinction that we're making here. It's not necessarily metaphysics as a broad kind of domain of knowledge. Let's go a little bit more deeper and talk about contingent and non-contingent realities. That would make more sense now, because anything science talks about is always going to be contingent, just by virtue of its methods. So, for example, the atheist philosopher of science, Elliot Sober, in his book Empiricism, he says that at any point in time, scientists are restricted to the observations they have at hand. That could be indirect and direct observations. That is the key kind of, I would even argue, non-negotiable aspect of science, right? If it's not observed in some way, then how can it even be science, right? Generally speaking. So the point here is anything that you observe, directly or indirectly, by virtue of that, it cannot be God, ever.
Yeah, I agree.
Exactly. That's the beautiful point. So we get this point.
Mm-hmm.
So that means, Adam, that science cannot negate or affirm God's existence in a direct way from this perspective. If you're going to use scientific evidence, it would have to be an evidential philosophical argument that may bring in some scientific data to try and justify its position. But that would not be a scientific perspective. That would be a philosophical argument. So what I would say is, and I think this echoes a lot of the scientists, a lot of the philosophers of science, is that really science cannot directly disprove God or even affirm. And sometimes when people say, oh, you know, science as a method proves God, I would even disagree with that, because when you have scientific data, you still have to philosophize over that data to infer God's existence in some way. For example, a very famous evidential argument for God's existence is the kind of modern version of the design argument that uses, for example, constants and physical constants and so on and so forth, and the physical laws. Now, it's also known as the fine-tuning argument. That argument is not a scientific one. It's actually a metaphysical one. It takes in scientific data and it says, right, does this make sense of our metaphysic, of our, you know, understanding that there is a fine tuner, if you like? That is not a scientific argument, though. It's an evidential argument. So with regards to the specific topic of today, when we say, can science disprove God or prove God, science, you know, as we used to say, bless its cotton socks. I don't know if people say that anymore, but, you know, science has a limited method. It has some philosophical presuppositions. And if you make science predicated on metaphysical, on methodological naturalism, then it really can stay silent on God's existence with regards to affirming or negating. And if you're going to affirm or negate using science, it won't be science anymore. It will be an evidential argument. So what I would say to you, Adam, I want you to explore something. I want you to stand in the possibility that, you know, look at your psychological epistemic drives. Why are you driven to come on Scdawah? Why are you driven to even make the claim that, you know, I believe in science to a certain degree and there are some nuances? Why do you even affirm there is a God or there isn't a God? I think one of the reasons is because we value truth, right? Truth is actually a value. Now, I want us to now discover, under one of the metaphysical presuppositions of science and under the methodology of science itself, can science really, I just saw something really funny. It says Sabur has evolved into Darwin himself. That was really funny. Like, I don't know why he's putting these quotes up. He's trying to put me off. But yeah, so where was I? Oh my God, he put me off.
About the value of truth.
Yeah, the truth as a value. How does that make sense under empiricism, number one, if we adopt that? And how does that make sense under the scientific method? Now, obviously, maybe that's for another discussion, another topic, but I want you to explore, to think about that, because in my view, I could be wrong. I stand in the possibility I could be wrong, but in my view, you can't ground value, truth as a value in empiricism or in the scientific method. You have to presume it. So if it's presumed, then what actually grounds it and makes sense of it? And that really, in my view, undermines just solely using empiricism and just solely using science in order to evaluate and come to the truth. And obviously that presupposes what you mean by truth, but that's something to think about.
It seems that we agree that we cannot directly prove God's existence or nor disprove his existence using science. However, and that's simply because we can only observe contingent realities. But this is where the nuance is. That would you consider, if we can, so say we prove the existence of other metaphysical beings, or what we consider metaphysical beings today, which may lie within the physical realm. Let's say we prove their existence using science in the future. Would you then consider that? Would you consider that proof for God's existence?
No, why would it be direct proof? Like, for me, I think a very powerful argument for the reason it wouldn't be proof for God's existence is because you would have to prove that science can now eventually change its method, change its philosophical presuppositions, and be able to discover things that are non-contingent. And that's going to be, it's like basically saying, let's use the historical method to solve an algorithm.
Yeah,
those are non-complementary. Those are non-complementary like ways of thinking. I'm not going to use the historical method to basically, I don't know, solve someone's marriage dispute, for example. This is not going to work, right?
I guess it would indicate God's existence, but not necessarily prove it per se. And then speaking on, I think it's interesting how you mentioned the value of truth and how we can't prove that scientifically. I would agree, but I think that we can prove. So I've constructed it's like an argument for where deriving human value from, from not from an atheist, because I'm not an atheist, but without God, pretty much.
Okay, let's hear it. Sounds good.
So yeah, I'm not like, I major in the sciences and math, so I'm not a philosophy major, but I do write some on the side. So basically, I think that anything that ultimately value is derived from uniqueness. So, for instance, so anything which the more unique something is in the world, the more value it has inherently. So humans, because what makes humans unique, and why do we value ourselves? We don't value ourselves for because it's not for our physical stature. Our physical bodies aren't what we value, because if we valued the size of physical objects, then we would value planets and other solar systems over us, for instance. We get our value from something beyond our physical bodies, or maybe how the atoms are arranged in a way that create us, our ability to reason. This is something unique that we don't find anywhere else in the universe, and therefore that's why we value humans over anything else, including animals. So because animals don't have the ability to reason, they don't have the unique cognitive functions that we do. So I think we derive, and that's why if God exists, he would have ultimate value, because he is ultimately unique, right? There's nothing like him. I mean, I know in the Islamic tradition, that is, you guys believe that, and in most religions, that's the case. So I think we can philosophically, we can philosophically reason our value without necessarily having our value attributed to us from God. But I guess you guys would say that this isn't necessarily objective. But then we get into the whole discussion of what makes something objective, and yeah.
Yes. So, one line of possible attack to this approach would be, yes, exactly, the objective subjective discussion. And in philosophy, although there is a nuanced discussion on this, but objective generally means that it's mind independent, meaning that, you know, if the whole world were to say, you know what, we don't value unique things anymore, right? It would still follow that unique things require that they must be valued, right? So when we say in moral philosophy, or in the terms of properties or moral values or values themselves, when we are saying they're objective, it means they're mind independent or emotions independent. So take, for example, let's move this to morality a little bit, if you like, just to make it easier. Say, for example, the Holocaust. We know the Jewish Holocaust was objectively morally evil. What we mean by objectively morally evil from the philosophical perspective, from a meta-ethical perspective, is that if the whole world were to come and agree that actually it was morally good, it would still be morally evil. So it's not contingent on an individual mind or individual minds and emotions. It's outside, so to speak. So since it's objective in that way, it requires some kind of grounding. And this when moral ontology comes into play. What is its source, and how can we explain that it's mind independent? And that's why there's a massive debate in metaethics on this issue. So when we talk about, for example, truth as a value, then if you want to claim truth is objective in that way, then just saying uniqueness would be slightly problematic, right? So you would say, well, how is it objective? Then it would be very difficult to say that, you know, a human conceptualization of uniqueness based on our own inductive understanding of what things are unique and how we come to the agreement that they're unique based on our own limited inferences. How does that now make truth actually objectively valuable? And that would be a problem from an objective subjective perspective. That's the first thing. The second thing is another line of attack, bro. Something that you need to realize is that what you need to do is figure out the link that you've made between uniqueness and value. Is that consistent with other things that you consider to be valuable? Because you could come up with a lot of thought experiments that actually show that something is not necessarily unique, even from a human point of view, and to devalue them would be actually immoral, right?
Could you give me an example, for instance?
The one thing that came to my mind was, for example, for example, you said that human beings, the reason they are valued is because they have rationality, they have cognitive functions, right? But there are human beings who do not have those type of cognitive functions. Are we not going to value them by virtue of the fact they have limited cognitive functions or impaired cognitive functions? I think that would be slightly problematic from a moral point of view, from an ethical point of view. And there are so many, you know.
My only response to that would be that, well, I mean, is morality really objective? I mean, even from your perspective, right? Morality is still contingent upon the existence of humans, right? So if humans didn't exist, because morality is centered around humans, nothing other than, so let's just say God existed on his own, right? Thought experiment. If God only existed, would morality exist? Would God's mercy exist? His potential for mercy, maybe, but there's nothing for him to be merciful.
Yeah. So just to be intellectually authentic with you, there is a difference of opinion in the schools of creed. And there are nuances within schools of creed, but on this particular issue, I adopt the Athari school of creed, which basically maintains that if no one would exist in the world, affirming the oneness of God is a high moral good, and basically doing shirk, associating partners with God, or not affirming would be still the greatest evil, even if there were people existing or not, right? So we believe, for example, these things are not contingent on human realities, because that would be slightly problematic when it comes to like the greatest evil in the Islamic tradition, which is shirk, which is polytheism, and the greatest good, which is affirming and worshipping God, right? Which is basically Tawheed, the oneness of the divine. So, you know, do those things only exist as good as long as humans exist? That would be slightly problematic, I think, from a kind of Islamic ethical, meta-ethical paradigm, but that's a different discussion. There's lots of debate in the different schools, and we do that in with wisdom and with compassion, and it's, you know, a brotherly discussion, if you like, yeah. But the point I'm trying to say is, yeah, fine. If you reject objectivity, then you reject objectivity. Then the whole point, moving back to your own truth being a value, then you diminish it as something subjective as well, as something that is just merely instrumental, which would maybe undermine your whole kind of thesis that uniqueness leads to value in some way. But I would affirm, of course, there are some things that you could really rely on on intuition, like your intuitive facts. And an intuitive fact for me is that killing an innocent human being without any type of justification is morally wrong, and it doesn't make any difference if the whole world were to come and agree on that. Even if they were to say it's morally right, it transcends them to a certain degree, and the way to ground that is to ground them in the commands of the divine. So I'm a divine command theorist from the point of view that I believe God's commands are derivative of his will, which is in line with his nature, meaning his names and attributes. So if God is Al-Bar, he is the source for goodness. If God is all-wise, all-knowing, then his commands are a manifestation of that. And God is transcendent. He can make the universal moral claim. And God is actually the source of all goodness. So even when if you were to apply the kind of threefold dilemma, I think it's a false dilemma, because there is a third option, because God is actually good, and he defines what good is because he's the being worthy of worship, and the being worthy of worship is the highest moral being. And one would argue, hold on a second, but how do you know that's the case? And you could continue this infinite regress. But when it comes to these type of metaphysical arguments, you need a metaphysical stopper. What metaphysic best explains the reality of objective moral truths? And I would say the divine command theory is one of those. It is the one that explains it. Now, if you argue now there are no objective moral truths, and that becomes very problematic, maybe not for you, but especially for the neo-atheists, especially those pointing the finger at the Sharia, at Islamic law, at religious
they're
ethics.
completely irrational. They have no argument.
Very irrational. I mean, they can't condemn objectively the KKK or ISIS, right? They can't do that. They don't have the philosophical grounding to be able to do that.
They're basically trying to justify
you're right. You're right. The whole objective moral argument to lead to God's existence is an axiomatic argument. You start with the idea that there are objective moral truths, and then you work your way. So you have to start with the idea. But the interesting thing is, from an atheistic perspective, it becomes like a double-edged sword, because if you end up rejecting objective moral truths, it undermines, a major strategy that many atheists adopt to point fingers at religious discourse and the religious traditions. But I think we've moved on too far now to go into morality, objective morality.
I don't want to.
But I just want you to explore the idea of grounding truth, and explore the two lines of a possible attack. And there are other lines of attack on your thesis, and maybe just explore it further, and maybe we could continue the discussion specifically on truth another time. But because today we're talking about science.
So Adam, if you could, in the private chat, put down your email address, and I'll put you directly into contact with Scdawah and also Hamza, because I'm sure he'd be very happy to continue this conversation after this live stream as well, because I think you've raised some very interesting points, and there's a lot more that could have been said.
I'll definitely come on, every time you guys have streams related to these discussions. But I don't want to take up too much of your guys' time.
Could you also hang around? I mean, we're going to go to the other guests, but if you could hang around, and then whenever you feel, if you can unmute yourself and give your perspective as well as we move through the guests, and make sure to put your email address in the private chat on the right. Can you actually see that right now? There's a link.
Let me see.
It says comment and then private chat.
Yeah, I see it.
Yep. So if you put it there, please.
Okay.
So and just stick around, and we'll go to the next guest. So I'd like to bring in Sadat to speak to Sam. Welcome, Sam, to Scdawah. Let us know your thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, I heard what Adam said, and it's interesting. I mean, I think a while back, before I became a Muslim, I had sort of similar questions of how do you prove the existence of God using science? Because science is something we use to reliably determine what is true, what is, you can't really just rely on people saying, yeah, I just believe in God and that's it. It's very weak argument, I believe, because the ones are right, the Christians are right, the Jews are right. You need science to actually confirm the truth. And over the years, the way I sort of resolved this was by thinking, okay, the first thing is no one can prove who God is or what God is. The only way you learn about God is when God tells you through Scripture. There's no other way. There's no human being who have been born with the knowledge of God. There's no, that's it. The only way we can get knowledge is from human beings.
So that your perspective on this topic and what Sam just said, brother Sam just said.
Yeah, in general, I would agree with that. But what does he mean by what God has told human beings? So is what God told human beings only through the Quran? Is it only through revelations and scriptures, or has he also told us something through our pre-programmed software that we call the fitra, the pre-knowledge of God that we already have? So I could potentially agree with his statement. Of course. We can also philosophically arrive and infer the existence of a creator God, of course, too. So even without any kind of scriptural revelation, and we see this all the time, we see that it's very easy for people in the West to shake off the church, to shake off Christianity, to shake off Catholicism. But shaking off God is a whole different story. Shaking off God is something that's much more difficult. And that's why most people kind of relapse, they fall into some kind of deist position. I don't think most people who leave religion go for hardcore atheism, but they go towards deism. And I know Brother Hamza has spoken a lot to that as well too. So, yeah, based on what the brother said, that's my feelings. Yeah.
Okay, Sam, we've had a few issues. I think internet issues, so he's gone off. If you can join us again, and then we can continue this conversation. I'd like to go to Carlos Jeffers, who is our regular sort of guest on Scdawah. Welcome. I believe the last time Hamza was on Scdawah, which is perhaps 6 months ago, you also had a very fruitful conversation. So what are your thoughts on this topic today?
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Welcome to Scdawah.
Hey, good to speak with you again. Always a pleasure to speak with you guys, so thanks for having me on again. My internet connection is a little bit choppy. I've missed some of the conversation, but I'll just try and persevere anyway.
Sure.
So yeah, my opinion on this question, can science prove God? I think my current answer to that is both yes and no. So I'll just explain. Now, I don't think we can, or science can prove God's existence, like prove it with a capital P, like the intrinsic nature of God. I think that's highly unlikely. But I think when I say yes, I mean that it can evidence God, or there's some claims about God that fall into the purview of science, because like some supernatural claims are, if they were true, they would exist in the natural world, and therefore would fall under the purview of science. Certain supernatural claims like the moon splitting, or flying animals, or talking ants, or power of prayer, or the fitra. All of these things are claims of things that exist in the natural world, and therefore I think that they by default fall under the purview of science. Now, science is obviously a method that we use to differentiate things that are real in the natural world and things that could be argued as just being in our imagination. So it does provide a methodology for people that want to make claims, be it supernatural, not just to do with religion. It could be to do with, I don't know, like a medium speaking to the dead or something like that. You can bring your claims to the scientific method, and as long as you can demonstrate it, you can provide a hypothesis, and then you provide your evidence, you provide your methodology, and then obviously it gets peer reviewed, and then it will either get accepted or thrown out. But at least science gives you that platform to make that claim and try and justify it. And I think, of all the supernatural claims that have been made, they've been unsuccessful using the scientific methodology. So I think for that reason, that's why a lot of atheists disregard supernatural claims, just because on that basis alone. So I don't know what you guys think about that.
Hamza, your thoughts on that? And thank you, Carlos, for explaining your perspective.
I think we've heard a lot from you. I want to hear from our beloved brother Sadat. Let's hear what our brother has to say.
Of course. So, brother Sadat, what's your thoughts on what Carlos was saying?
What was the summary of the question at the end?
I guess the upshot is that, you know, science can be used for, say, something like finding out if mediums who can read minds, or, you know, the effectiveness of prayer, something Richard Dawkins speaks about in the God Delusion, how, you know, he's not totally agreeing with science being able to prove God's existence, and nor is he totally negating that possibility. But he's saying that there's at least a what you call it. I mean, I guess he's disagreeing with the non-overlapping magisteria idea, right? He believes there is a sort of overlap, and there's a way of verifying miracles and other sort of unseen things. So, Carlos, did I capture that correctly? Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's what he's basically saying. So that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the examples that he gave was the fitra. So Islam's claim, which I alluded to earlier on, that we are born with this pre-programmed software package in us that leads us to intuitively believe in the existence of a creator. I mean, that's something that, you know, they're starting to do studies on now. I think, was it Justin Barrett? Do I have the right name? But there was a study that was done on whether children innately believe in God or not. And they found that most do. So even without being taught religion or God, most of us have that innate belief in God. So that would be one example of where, yes, there could be an overlap, you know, between religion and science proving religion. But again, as Brother Hamza said earlier on, for science to directly prove God, you know, that is a different story. So that's something that I don't believe is possible, because basically it would be a category error, right? To reduce God to a bunch of atoms, except that he's just a really big bunch of atoms somewhere in outer space, as opposed to a limited set of small atoms in the human body on Earth in Palestine 2,000 years ago. It would be a category error to make this mistake, when what we are saying is that God is the creator of everything, including time and space. So in the Quran, for example, it says, "Wal asr innal insana lafi khusr." God swears by the time that man is at a loss. So what some commentators, you know, derive from this is that God is not at a loss when it comes to time. You know, God is not restricted by time. He's not in a box of time or space. So I would still agree with what Brother Hamza said, that for science to directly prove God, no. But you are right. There could be an overlap when and where religion is making some kind of scientific claim. If it is, then of course those kinds of claims could be tested, right? So, I mean, for example, the Exodus, according to the Bible, the amount of people that the Bible alludes to, it would have been around 2 million people doing the Exodus from Egypt to the Promised Land. So we can do archaeology and we can try to uncover that. Okay, were there that many people? Are there any signs or evidences left of such an Exodus? So there can be an overlap. I hope I understood your question correctly, Carlos.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's I'm trying to think. With science, obviously, like I said, it goes through the process of distinguishing things that are real from things that are imaginary. I mean, you mentioned the fitra and this intuition that we have, this innate knowledge of God, or feeling that God exists. You know, if you're saying that studies have been done on that, this is exactly what I'm saying. Like, science doesn't disregard any kind of supernatural claims. So it will assess it and then disregard it if you can't justify it, but it will at least allow you to do that. So, you know, it's you know, you've got, you know, the floor is yours in terms of whatever claims you have to make, and science will it will evaluate the evidence. And again, even if it, you know, like we're saying, I think you mentioned earlier, indirect observations. That's effectively what it would be, because, like you said, we can't observe God directly, so science just can't get into that conversation. But you know, prayer, in some religions, people think that they have a direct link to God, and therefore you could, through those indirect observations, prove God's existence, or not necessarily prove God's existence, but at least justify evidence for the existence of God. And then you could, you know, you build up your evidence, like with evolution, it builds up its evidence and puts it together and gives an explanation. So you could do exactly the same for God. So in that sense is what I'm saying, yes, that science can help us learn the truth of God. And obviously, if it doesn't exist, then it, you know, the scientific method will produce results to say what you're saying isn't justified. Therefore, we can argue that what your claim is just in your imagination and not real.
See, do you guys mind if I rebuttal? So Carlos, it seems that, well, actually, I disagree with you. So when science is met with something which it can't explain, it actually doesn't resort to a supernatural explanation. And I'll explain why this is relevant. So you mentioned that we can test, so we can, like, you know, carry out experiments to test whether prayer actually works. For instance, you use that example, and therefore, if it is true, or what happens if, like, a prayer is actually carried out and it's true, then therefore we can prove the existence or prove the truth of that prayer, right? Actually, no, we wouldn't. So let's say, for instance, we actually carried out that experiment, and someone made a prayer, someone that believed in God made a prayer, and that prayer came to be. Scientists wouldn't actually credit that to God. They would either say it was by chance, by coincidence, or that there were other factors which aren't being taken into account. So no, science actually doesn't regard the supernatural at all. And I'll give you another example. It's interesting. I don't know if you guys heard about this, but in the late 20th century, there was this phenomenon where they would let birds, I think they were seagulls, out in the middle of the ocean off the British Isles, and they would always find their way back to where they were came from. But then they kept doing the experiment, and they blindfolded them because maybe they thought, maybe they can see past the cloud, and then they thought, and then even though they were blindfolded, the birds still arrived back at their destination. And then they did the experiment again, and because the scientists were looking for natural explanations, they thought maybe they can detect the magnetic waves coming back, from the carried through the air. So then they actually put magnets on the birds to distort this detection, this magnetic detection, and the birds still managed to get back to their destination. So eventually, they after a certain number of tests, they had no explanation, no natural one. So it came to a stopping point, and they didn't resort to a supernatural explanation. Science actually never does. So I think you're mistaken there.
Yeah. What was it you said at the beginning there about science seems supernatural? Something along those lines you said?
Science will never resort to a supernatural explanation, even if the phenomenon is unexplained.
I think that's
okay.
a great.
So that's not what I was saying.
Adam brought
That's
up.
not what. Yeah. So just to clarify, that's not what I was saying. That they would resort to the supernatural. They wouldn't do that because we don't have any evidence of the supernatural. So they wouldn't. They only resort to things that have been verified, and only natural things have been verified so far. So when supernatural.
Sorry, did you not say we can test certain beliefs like prayers and fortune tellers and things like that, which are claimed to be supernatural? You said that science can test those things.
Yeah, but that's not the same as resorting to a supernatural explanation. So if I have a supernatural... Sorry, let me just finish. So if I have a supernatural claim, I'm the one that's making the claim that it's supernatural, not science. So the burden of proof is on me to demonstrate my supernatural claim and demonstrate that it's supernatural in a methodological way. That's what I'm saying. And you can do that through prayer. You could do that through many, or whatever. It depends what the claim is. But, you know, even if we prove that prayer works, again, like I agree with you, it doesn't prove God's existence. And science may try and come up with a different explanation, but it's just one bit of evidence for a huge answer that we're trying to fill. Like evolution, if we just found one fossil, that's not going to prove evolution. You need to build a case, and you need to build up evidences, and that's pretty much what I was trying to get across.
Just to positively interject here, I think it's important for us to make a couple of distinctions here. So if we are holding on to the general view, I know there's nuances, that science is predicated on philosophical, on methodological naturalism, that any of its conclusions cannot refer to supernatural activity, that it cannot refer to any divine activity, then by virtue of that, I think Adam is right. And Carlos, I think you need to maybe reassess what you mean by science, because if a religion makes a supernatural claim that God answers prayer, and you said, well, that claim itself can be tested and we can find out if that's scientific or not, well, basically you won't get far. The reason you won't get far is because science is predicated on methodological naturalism that says that any conclusion cannot be referred to supernatural activity. So it's like unfair. It's like there's a method that rejects all supernatural claims. There's a method that says you cannot refer to any divine activity in any way. Let's use that method to try and prove divine activity. It's just not going to work, right? So I think you need to reevaluate what you mean by science. But because I have to leave and I have a meeting, I really love these sessions. I would love to be invited more often. It's beautiful. May Allah bless you all. It's an honor being here. Thanks for the invite, Scdawah. Everyone, please support Scdawah with your du'as, with your donations, and with your support, please. Phenomenal work. And they have an Arabic channel as well, I believe, and so on and so forth. Support all of their great work. So I wanted to mention something that it somehow relates to the whole supernatural stuff. You know, one of the greatest miracles, if you like, one of the greatest supernatural things is actually ourselves. Is the fact that we are conscious, that we have consciousness. There is a first person holistic experience. There's a first person experience, and there's an inner subjective conscious experience. I don't think anyone on this panel would say that when they're having a hot chocolate on a Sunday morning, just looking at the sunrise, that they're going to say they're not having an inner subjective conscious experience. Of course they are. They have an experience of what it is like to have a hot chocolate, and they have an experience of what it's like to look at a sunrise. So that is what you call an inner subjective conscious experience. In the language of philosophy, this is called a phenomenal experience. In the language of neuroscience, this is a qualia. Yeah, qualia. It's an experience that can be defined as qualia. Now, interestingly, I would argue science cannot explain this first person fact ever, right? Let me explain why. Because neuroscience, which really is pixelated phrenology, is a pixelated understanding of the phrenos, right? Greek word phrenology, the study of the brain. So it's a pixelated understanding. It doesn't know what it's doing at the moment concerning consciousness, because neuroscience has a philosophical assumption. You could go to any of the works, go to Rex Wilson, go to Manzotti, Moderato, the whole works. They all agree. Even the Italian professor, Anthony Ravoncio, he says all of the science, the neuroscience, has a philosophical assumption. What's that philosophical assumption? Physicalism. What's physicalism? In the philosophy of the mind, physicalism or materialism, they use synonymously. I know the different histories, but they use synonymously. Physicalism is the view that consciousness can be reduced to or is identical to physical processes, in other words, the brain. They have to assume that. So whatever neuroscience does, it can never show the kind of inverted commas supernatural aspect of consciousness, which we have a first person fact that we have inner subjective conscious states. And therefore, neuroscience will never answer this question because it's methodologically and philosophically and metaphysically restricted, because it has to assume physicalism to be true. So my point is this: how do we now start to prove this first person fact that I have an inner subjective conscious experience? There's many ways. One way is eliminative materialism or eliminative physicalism, which basically, like the Churchlands, Patricia Churchland and her husband, they are, I think it's her husband, they argue this. They basically say that there is no such thing as inner subjective conscious experience. It's just physical stuff. This is just an illusion. I think Dan Dennett, he wrote a book in 1991. His views may have changed slightly, but he basically wrote a book called Consciousness Explained. And some philosophers said that it should have been called Consciousness Explained Away, because he basically says there is no inner subjective conscious experience. This first person fact doesn't exist. That's eliminative materialism. You have then reductive materialism or reductive physicalism, which basically says that you can reduce inner subject conscious states to physical processes in some way, maybe not to bits of matter, but to processes. But there is an objection against this. The objection is, well, what is the main problem here? Well, the main problem is what you call the hard problem of consciousness, which basically says that we don't know what it's like for someone else to have an inner subjective conscious state. I know what it's like to have a hot chocolate on a Sunday, but I don't know what it's like for Sabor to have hot chocolate on a Sunday. And even if he describes it to me in his own language, it's his language. Words are vehicles to meaning, and meaning is a representation of inner subjective conscious states. It doesn't give me access to what really is his inner subjective conscious state. It's just language. So that's the first problem. The second problem is, well, how do inner subjective conscious states arise from seemingly non-conscious physical processes? According to physicalism or atheistic philosophical naturalism, physical processes are blind. There's nothing intentionally directing them anywhere, and they're non-conscious, meaning they're not aware of themselves and they're not aware of anything outside of themselves. So how can that give rise to this spookiness called inner subjective conscious state, that I'm a first-person conscious experience, that I'm experiencing something within and external to me? I have intentionality, meaning my conscious process is about something other than the process itself. So how on earth can physicalism, reductive materialism or physicalism explain inner subjective conscious experiences? Because it can't solve the epistemic gap, what it's like for other people to have inner subjective conscious state, and it can't solve the ontological question on how do these seemingly blind, non-conscious physical processes bring about inner subjective conscious experience. Then they move on and they talk about functionalism. I'm almost done, by the way. I do apologize. 2 minutes. Functionalism, generally speaking, is the view that the human being is like a computer, which they've moved on now. They've dismissed this idea, a lot of them. It does not make sense of cognition and the holistic understanding of consciousness. Anyway, functionalism is that you have inputs, mental states, and outputs. So an input is, I see a dog running towards me. The mental state is, I'm scared. And the output is, I run away. Input, mental state, output. And that's how they discuss crudely what functionalism is. The problem is, this doesn't address the problem of consciousness as we discussed, because it doesn't tell us what those mental states are in terms of what it's like for someone else to have that mental state. And it doesn't discuss how on earth that mental state arises from seemingly blind, non-conscious physical processes. Then you have something the last physicalist kind of understanding is this, which is how on earth, they say you have emergent materialism. There's two types of emergent materialism, strong and weak. Strong emergent materialism is that basically that inner subjective conscious state arises from a complexity of physical processes that are all causally connected in some way, but we just don't know how. With all due respect, that's saying magic. Let's say, let's believe in magic. There's so much complexity going on, we'll never know how. It's the equivalent of putting Darwin's book in a hamster's cage, thinking the hamster is going to understand its origins. Yeah, that's strong emergent materialism. The other view is weak emergent materialism, which basically says, no, we can unpack all of the complex causal processes going on and we can reduce it to this complexity. But that suffers from the same problem as reductive materialism, reductive physicalism, which doesn't really address the question. So, in summary, and this is to plant the seed in your heart and mind because I have to go, and we could maybe discuss consciousness and AI on another Scdawah thing. It would be great. I would love to join that, because that was my kind of postgrad on consciousness. What I would say now is this shows clearly that one of the greatest supernatural realities, which is our own inner subjective conscious states that no one would deny, cannot be explained by science, cannot be explained by physicalism. So let's put that in our philosophical pipe and smoke it. I'm really happy to see Yusuf ponders. A giant has entered, so I have to leave now, the unworthy. May Allah bless him. As I said to everybody, his essay on nihilism is up. It's so long, it's so beautiful that when you read it, you might become a nihilist. I'm only kidding. It's a beautiful essay. I'm looking forward to part 2. It's up. I'm marketing it tomorrow, but you guys have an insight. If you go to sapiencinstitute.org, you see the essay. It's one of the best essays on there. Carl, you take care. I'm going to speak to you very soon. Let's do a topic on consciousness. Adam, take care.
Yes, you too.
I love you to bits. Sadat, I love you. Take care of yourself, Habibi. I need to go, guys. Have a meeting. Thanks for allowing me to have this end rant, because it's one of my topics that I really love, consciousness. But as for me, I love you all. Stay safe, everybody. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah. Okay, welcome, Mr. Ponders.
Yusuf, sorry, 1 second before, while you lot get your salams of the way. Brother Shabi is on his way, as many are asking. MashaAllah, he's just setting up now, so he should be joining us in a moment. Assalamu alaikum, Yusuf, and all of you.
Wa alaikum salam. Sorry it took me so long. I had to wait for my daughter to pass out, and that took a little bit longer than...
You should have read the nihilism essay.
I just fell asleep as well.
I think you discovered the cure to insomnia there. 17,000 words.
With the footnotes, I think it was over 18,000.
18. So. It's actually a short book, isn't it? It's like
pretty much.
Half a paperback. A paperback would be like 35. So 17, yeah, that's about right. So Yusuf, obviously this is a topic that you must have, as a former atheist, thought about, science and its limits. In fact, I remember when I received an email from you sometime last year, or I think the year before, and then I replied back to the email, I think after 4 months or something.
Yeah,
that
2019.
was 2019. I think the email you sent me is you wrote an article about science as art, and within that you spoke about the limitations of science, and obviously you're very much in tune with this topic. I'm just going to send the admin the link to that so you can share it while you speak. So give us your perspective on this, but just before we get you to speak, I just want to go back to Carlos. Carlos, you didn't get time to obviously respond to what Hamza was saying. Can you direct your question to Yusuf? If there's still some residual stuff left.
Yeah, there's plenty left, mate. Yeah, hi Yusuf. Hey, mate.
How you doing, Carlos?
Cool, man. Yeah, so just to say that I don't subscribe to scientism in a philosophical naturalism. I don't subscribe to that view. So I think there's other paths to truth. Maybe there's undiscovered paths to truth that we can use, and if there's a better method than science to do that, then we should absolutely use that. But obviously for me, like, science is the best method that we have at the moment, and like it doesn't try to explain everything. Like, so take gravity, for instance. Gravity is a phenomenon that we experience. We can't see it or explain its intrinsic nature, but we can measure it in equations, and we can see the effects that it has on the materialistic world. And that's kind of what I'm saying for God. Like, it's not going to prove God with a capital P, like his intrinsic nature, but through indirect observations in the natural world, we can use the claims that have been made by theists. Because, obviously God's existence is one question, but obviously depending on which religion you're in, you're making certain claims that go off of that, extend from that, and not all of the claims, but some of the claims, or maybe majority of the claims, are, if they were true, they would exist in the natural world and therefore fall under the purview of science. And science can either prove that to be true or disprove it to be true. And obviously, if it proves it to be true, then that's one notch towards closer understanding towards God. And then if you can provide, multiple evidences in the same way and they be proved true, then collectively we can then sort of say, like science does say, it doesn't say it with absolute certainty, but it says, like, evolution is probably a true fact. It doesn't say it with absolute certainty, and that's what I think science could do for a God through indirect observations. So that's kind of my argument.
Yeah. Just sorry, Yusuf. Just before you reply to Carlos, Admin, could you please share the link that I sent you on WhatsApp? On the screen, please, if you could share it. So just before Yusuf gives his reply to Carlos, and it's in the comments, I highly recommend this short essay that Yusuf wrote on science is an art, which forgot that it's actually an art. So there you can see this. And this, when I read it some over a year ago, I'm going to have to, make sure I don't understate it. This is really a unique perspective, which is pretty much neglected, not only at a popular level, I would say even at an academic level. So definitely read this article if you're interested in the topic that we're discussing today. Sorry, Yusuf, please continue.
Yeah, no, don't worry. So just in answer to what you mentioned a moment ago, Carlos, with regards to science, I feel lonely now. I'm the only camera. Yeah, with science being the best tool or the only tool, it's not necessarily like a competition with it. It's, there's certain jobs for certain tools. If you want to get a nail in the wall, you pick a hammer. If you want to pull a screw out of the wall, you pick a screwdriver, and so on and so forth. So you pick your tool depending on the context. And in many cases, science is a great tool, and it will do the job. But when you're trying to deal with something, for example, like God, that is something that is transcendent beyond the world. My usual go-to analogy for this is like trying to find God with science is like trying to find the painter in the painting. And there's an obvious problem with that, in that the thing that creates the thing that is created isn't going to be found explicitly in the creation. And so this is one of the big problems now, and there are other issues as well. So with science, it does have its limits, and it can take you so far. And with that essay that Brother Scdawah was sharing with you all, I talk about how science is an art form, and this was what art was always used for. It was a way of trying to reveal truth to the one that saw the art. The artist is always trying to communicate in one way or another a truth, and science was just a very complicated version of this. And you think of the atom. So the thing that I kind of hone in on in that essay is the atom, and even the name atom meant indivisible. And funnily enough, obviously, as time kind of went on, we invented the atom bomb, which is literally the devising of an atom, and then all that energy is released, and you get this huge explosion. But we kept the name, even though it was it became this oxymoron, the indivisible bomb, which the atom bomb, with the atom being indivisible and the bomb itself being the consequence of the division of that thing. And we think of, for example, when we're getting taught about the atom in science in college or in high school, and you get this image, everyone thinks of this particular thing when you're talking about an atom. Is that typical, the nucleus with the electrons floating around it. And this it's not what atoms look like. We can't really say with certainty what an atom, if you were to be able to perceive it, what it would look like, just because there are limits and things. So when it comes to looking at the small, microscopes have their limits, because microscopes use obviously light with the standard microscope. And so the limit is the wave of light. And if you start trying to look at things smaller than the wave of light, you start to lose focus, and it gets to a point where you have no clarity in your pictures. And then you can move down to the electron microscopes, and obviously the wavelength of an electron microscope is much smaller than the wavelength of light, and so you can see much clearer images of much smaller things. But again, that has a limit. Like, how are you going to use an electron to see what electrons look like, and things like that? And so you've got this limit. Atoms, they have a reality, but what they look like, we don't know. And we use art to try and get this across. But when you're teaching it to children, half of the time there's not really much effort maybe put into telling them this isn't what an atom looks like. This is an artistic representation, but science is constantly trying to communicate these truths through art. And it also touching on another problem that I think is quite interesting. So this idea of randomness, Brother Sabor has mentioned and had a chat with Brother Faraz. Is it Zahabi? Is that how you say his name? The Sabor.
He's muted, but yeah, that's how you say it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sorry, I mute myself in between, so I have to jump.
No. Don't worry.
I'm sorry. Just on that topic that you mentioned, the Faraz Zahabi, obviously interview. There were some very interesting perspectives there, but I do want the admin to highlight a comment which has come in from our brother Abdullah. Not Abdullah, Asadullah from the Andalusian Project at 8:21. 8:21. Could you go to the comment 8:21 p.m.? Sorry, Yusuf, you just
No, sorry.
me off. There's a really interesting comment I was reading. No, the comment at 8:21, please, which says, "Science being a tool, yes, but a tool for what? Science doesn't inform us about most of the things that make us human, most of what we experience and value as human beings." That's a really great insight, and I did want Yusuf to obviously complete what he's saying, but also give his perspective on that.
Yeah. So touching on this, the issue with a lot of things is not everything is quantifiable. Science obviously deals best with things that can be quantified. So you're looking at things like weight, distance, speed, things like that, things that can be written down, and like I can say this is 10 centimeters long. What do you have when you measure it? And they go 10 centimeters. It's like, and what about you? 10 centimeters. All right, so everyone's agreeing here, 10 centimeters. But you can't. Can you do that with values, as brother from the Andalusian Project pointed out, Asabella, that these things venture beyond that, and this is also like ends up kind of leading into the conversations about utilitarianism. And in an ideal world, if you could quantify pain, if you could quantify pleasure, compare them, like for example, the pain of a chicken to the pain of, say, a human being and what's not, maybe science could start to get into that. But as touching on the issue of the problem of consciousness, as Brother Hamza was mentioning on as well, that we can't exit our own subjective experiences. You can document as much as you want about a bat. You can figure out all you can about its atomic structure, its weight, it's this, it's that, but it'll never tell you what it's like to be a bat. And this touches on the issues with subjectivity, and it's also why the idea of things being subjective has become a sort of a dirty word for people like Richard Dawkins. They often kind of make it synonymous with falseness. But to be human is to have subjective experiences. It's to have feelings. It's to have the feeling of awe. How do you quantify that? Like when you're kind of engrossed in this amazing experience where no matter where you look, you're just captivated by what you see. These are incredible experiences that the human being can have, and you have this strange sense of self-consciousness, and it really kind of captivates you. And there can be life-changing moments that can completely transform a person when they experience such things. But science can't prod that with thermometers. It can't do anything to explore what it means to be a subject, what it means to experience subjective things, and how to experience these things. It can try its best to explain it, but it can only go so far with it. And the reason I wanted to mention Faraz Zahabi, because in that podcast you had a conversation about randomness, and with this, it sort of links to this idea of science being art. And I think one of the problems with randomness, so that the issue that he brought up was the fact that they're trying to talk about the quantum physics being fundamentally random. And they talk about the fact that there's, for example, there's when a particle has a half-life, there's one half of it is destroyed and the other half stays, or to some degree. I can't remember exactly how you refer to it as, but there's a part of an particle that just deteriorates, and they say that there's no reason why one deteriorates over the other half, and so they're saying this is fundamentally random, and there's no way of kind of getting around this, and this is a majority opinion, I think, in the sciences. But the issue with this, I think, stems from this using mathematics as a way of describing something that's beyond our senses. And so, for example, when you're talking about 1 + 1 = 2, the 1 theoretically is identical to the other one. So when you have 1 + 1, ideally, when you're talking in numbers, these ones are completely equal, and they equal 2. But the thing is obviously, when it comes to talking about the particles and things like that, they're trying to describe them with mathematical formula. And I think many scientists have kind of gotten into this trap of focusing so much on the art, that is the mathematical representation of the things that they're looking at, that they sort of end up making them equivalent. And so in the same way, if I say 1 + 1 = 2, I see 1 and 1 being identical. I can't see what's distinct between them. But then if you look at the two things, it's like, well, this one is not completely identical to that one. And if you're only talking about these things in terms of the ideal mathematic principles that underlie them, then you might overlook the differences that might cause something different to happen. For example, I might prefer the color brown over the color pink, and so I might throw this one in the bin and keep it. Obviously, that's to do with value and choice. But when it comes to particles, there may be distinct differences between the different elements of the particles and things like that. But again, it's this idea of the scientists get so enraptured in the art that they use to represent reality. That they start to confuse the art as reality.
So
in the same way.
Sorry to just interject, but I mean, you've made some very interesting points there, but just to make sure we don't lose some of our guests who are here for a bit of time, if I could bring them in, and then you can carry on your perspective, and I'm sure they can comment on that as well.
It'd probably be better to just start engaging now anyway.
Peter, welcome to Scdawah Live. What are your thoughts on what we have been discussing so far? Peter, you need to...
My daughter's awake and she's crying.
Okay.
Go for it, Yusuf.
So, Peter, would you like to unmute your mic? If not, we could go to
Peter's in shock. Red Pen, you there?
Red Pen? Peter just unmuted himself. So Peter, go back to Peter for a second.
Yep.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi, hello. Can you speak up a little bit?
Scdawah Live.
Thank you.
What is your question today? Good. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, so on the topic of science, there is something which theists never talk about, which is that science only makes sense if God exists. And because for science to even work, you have to presuppose that our universe is designed, that our universe is rational and accessible to the human mind and predictable. And and I feel like this is something which theists never talk about pretty much. Like, to quote, for example, Paul Davies, he says, even the most atheistic scientists accept as an act of faith the existence of a law-like order in nature that is at least in part comprehensible to us. And so atheists, they cannot explain why our universe is rational and predictable, and especially the fact that mathematics, a beautiful and elegant language, which is surprisingly applicable to reality. Like, this is so convenient. Like, why would the realm of material concrete care about any of this? Like, why would it care to act in accordance with such universal and abstract mathematical forms? So I think this makes no sense under atheism. And I think theists need to, like, they need to talk about this more than they should, you see.
Okay, thank you, Peter, for giving your perspective. So, brother, so that on the point of, you need science to basically, you need God to essentially do science, but also we could extend this to say, science flourished within a theistic sort of worldview with Christianity and Islam. What are some of your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, where there's laws, there has to be a lawmaker. So, with these mathematical laws, with these scientific laws, with the fact that we can put faith in these kind of static physical laws that are there that we can use to test things, we can do science because of these laws. All of this, to me, indicates that there has to be there has to be an intelligent force behind all of this. There has to be an intelligent force behind all of this. Sorry, what was the second point that he had made?
It's
Okay,
basically
so
how it's underused as a sort of point. So I want to bring in Adam and Carlos here. Now, Adam, from my understanding, is a theist who is who's joining the panel, and Carlos is an agnostic or an atheist. I forget which one. I'd like your thoughts on this idea that God is a necessary concept that you need in order to actually make sense of the uniformity of nature. And Sadat, if you could please host for a few minutes, and I'll be back.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I'll go first. I mean, he's a necessary being if on a few conditions. So there are multiple different escape avenues, if you will, that atheists tend to take to explain how mathematical abstractions align with the physical world. And one of these escape routes, or one of these alternative explanations other than God, is that there are an infinite number of universes, and so in universes other than ours, there are different laws of logic, and therefore different mathematical laws arise, and the physical worlds are different. So these laws vary. So that's one explanation, an atheistic explanation. Now, so that's why it's not necessary that because these mathematical relationships model the universe, a God is necessary. Now, I personally believe I believe in a God. I wouldn't say his existence is necessary per se.
Go on, Abbas. Looks like you were going to say something.
No, I'm just sort of just nodding and just saying "Walaikum assalam" to the people that said salam. That's all. Yeah. I think ultimately, when these type of discussions come about, clearly theists, if they're sensible, they wouldn't say that there's empirical evidence for God, because empiricism relies upon observational science, basically, how science is performed through experimentation and observation. And Allah makes it very clear that, there are certain things that are seen and there are certain things that are unseen. And I think for science to then argue that somehow we would be able to be sophisticated enough, knowledgeable enough to somehow outwit the Creator. And even if the Creator desired that he would not be discovered in that way, that somehow we would achieve it, that somehow we would be able to do it. It just seems like a really sort of silly argument to me. I think ultimately what it comes down to, I think, is, and this is how most of our truths, as it were, come about, is what do we find reasonable? Do we find it reasonable that this universe could have, however it happened, whether we discuss multiverse, whether we discuss whatever we discuss, but is it reasonable to say that something can come from nothing? Now, obviously, science can't answer that. And science might say, well, in the future, we might be able to discover this. But ultimately, that's going to now be a philosophical discussion. It's going to be a discussion based upon reason, upon experience. It's going to be a discussion based upon what one finds reasonable. And one can't say that, therefore, if I believe this or I believe that, that's somehow empirical. And it's 100%, it's provable. And I don't think we should ever make that claim, whether we believe solely in science or we believe in the metaphysical, sense of religion and angels and God and what have you.
Yeah, I also I think this ties pretty well into when Hamza Zortzis was here, and we were talking about the distinction between the physical and the metaphysical world. Yeah, and how really when we say the seen world, as Plato puts it, and as in the Quran it's also phrased this way, the seen world is actually relative to the observer, or to the agent. So the seen world to God is everything. There is no unseen world to him. But for us, because of our finite existence, there are things which are unseen, or in other words, undetectable, because we know that there are things that are unseen to the human eye. We know this via science, actually. But there are also things which not only are they unseen, but they're undetectable by any of our senses. This is science will never be able to actually detect these things. And one of these things is God. Unless it would change its methodology and its philosophy, which that would no longer become science then.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, much earlier on in this conversation, I wanted to say that as much as I want to disagree with you, Adam, I'm forced to agree with you, because, like that example that was given by Carlos earlier on of, for example, trying to scientifically measure the efficacy of prayer, even if we get positive data for that can still be interpreted as just the efficacy of positive thinking, right? That can still be a placebo effect or something like that. So as Hamza said earlier on, even if we have empirical data, scientific data pointing towards God, we still have to philosophize over that data in order to process it, interpret it, apply it, and interpret that to mean that God exists. So bottom line for me is that that nature cannot ultimately explain nature. That's the thing. Nature cannot ultimately explain nature. There has to be something metaphysical or supernatural that explains the existence of nature. And science is a tool that we use to measure nature. Pondering Soul, Yusuf said earlier on that it's used to measure things, the length of things, the size, the weight, maybe, the brightness of things. But how do you measure love, right? How do you document the dream that you had last night? How do you objectively, scientifically evaluate beauty? These are things that we all know intuitively they exist, but they cannot be empirically proven, shown, evaluated, or put under a microscope. So because of the Islamic definition of God, the minute you put something under a microscope and say, there he is, there's God, we as Muslims are going to say, no, that's not God, because God is something greater than that, which you can't put in a box. So I think we're basically in agreement on that point.
MashaAllah. Jazakallah khair, brother Sadat. I just want to say Assalamu alaikum to brother Shabi Yusuf. Jazakallah khair for joining, Aki.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Yeah, people were saying you were out buying many mics to drop. That's why you're a little bit late.
I know. I wish I could. Then I will have a mic that is clear.
Shabir, I think you were waiting that after I came on, you wanted to have the star appearance right at the end. Have the shock and awe, mashallah.
Look, I always think that the master should come first and the students after.
MashaAllah. May Allah bless you, Aki. May Allah bless you. Brother Shabi, as you know, we're having a show on Can Science Prove God? And I think, Carlos, were you mentioning earlier on that so did you say science can prove God, or will be able to prove God, or at least supernatural beings, such as angels, etc.?
Hello? Yes. Yeah, so what I was basically saying is that it can't prove God's intrinsic existence or nature, but it can prove God's existence through indirect observations in the natural world based on the claims made by theists, depending on what religion it is. For argument's sake, like I said before, the power of prayer, if you're making a claim that you have a link to God through the power of prayer, then science, that falls automatically under the purview of science. It's something that can be demonstrated to be true or not true. You know, we have obviously our intuitions about reality and stuff like that, and there can be an infinite way, a number of ways to describe certain things that happen in reality. And science is the methodology that's the most reliable one that we have of distinguishing things that are hypotheses that are imaginary or hypotheses that are actually real. And that's effectively what I'm saying. So the claims that are made by theists exist in the natural world and therefore fall under the purview of science. That's in a nutshell what I'm saying.
Okay, so would angels come under that? Would you say that science can prove angels?
Well, in terms of angels, I don't necessarily know. It depends on what your claim is about angels. If you're saying that angels can enter into the natural world, then by all means, yeah, it falls under the purview of science.
Carlos, can I just ask you a quick question? Say that there were a whole group of people that did pray and actually their prayers got answered. Somebody was sick and they got better. Could science simply say, well, that's maybe quantum entanglement because our consciousness and everything is somehow intertwined and we don't know how, but this could just be a case of quantum entanglement. These people willed something to happen. They effectively worked with or interfered with, the quantum haze around them or whatever, and somehow they managed to do this. Science would always come up with a physical explanation, and at times it could be, Carlos, a physical explanation actually that could never be disproved or proved, for example. And so I think that's the point, Carlos. You see, that what we're trying to say here is that, and I think this is where perhaps sometimes the debate does get stuck in this sort of in this realm of ambiguity and difficulty. So for me, for example, as a Muslim, it's not just about logical or philosophical arguments that convince me of a creator or convince me of the prophet or convince me that angels exist, for example. For Muslims or for people who believe, who are theists, but certainly for us Muslims, speaking for us, I would say it's a multifaceted approach to believing in the creator, so that we have physical things that we can look at, tangible, that we can evaluate the claims of. So, for example, the Quran. We can look at the history, for example, of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Seerah. We can look at things within the Seerah. All of these things put together, and of course, using one's reason as well. Because if one looks at, for example, as I say, the universe, looks at matter, looks at energy, it's a rational question. It's an obvious, intuitive question to ask, where did this come from? And to have a infinite material series of causes is not rational to the average person, I would suggest. And that would not be a reasonable explanation. So it's about using your reason, but it's also about looking at things that are perhaps more tangible rather than just a philosophical argument, looking at the Quran, looking at the Hadith, looking at the life of the Prophet, looking at the prophecies within it, looking at the way in which the Quran is constructed and the evidences for its divinity there. So there's, as I said to you, it's not just one, it's not like a one-hit wonder. It's not just like a one thing that we sort of look at to come to a conclusion on God and on the metaphysical sense of our reality.
Jazakallah khair, Abbas. That was a really interesting perspective, especially about how they can use quantum entanglement as an ad hoc rationalization for this whole thing about prayer. I'm definitely going to use that. Brother Shabir and Brother Abbas, welcome. MashaAllah.
Jazakallah khair. How are you, my brother?
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah.
Excellent.
So Brother Abbas gave a really interesting perspective there. I want to hear yours as well before we go back to Carlos.
To be honest with you, Brother Sabu, Master Ji just spoke What is there to say after what he just said? Not much.
No more mics to drop.
Shabir, listen, Shabir,
Yes,
I still watch your videos to learn from you. So please don't embarrass me. Don't embarrass me, please.
not at all. Wait, actually, you know what? If I can just put my 2 pennies worth here, Brother Adam, was
Yes.
it Brother Adam who you're speaking to? How are you, my brother? Are you okay?
Yes, and you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. Can I just ask a question? And just bear with me for a second, my dear panelists. Can I ask you a question? Are you able to conceive of something that is inconceivable?
No, you cannot conceive of something that's inconceivable. That would be a contradiction.
Excellent, excellent. That is what I expected you to say. Yeah. Now, if we were to take the creator, or God as we commonly understand it, if we were to take the creator, would we need to know absolutely everything about the creator to be able to know what intrinsically a creator is?
No, we don't. Just like we don't know everything about any field of science, yet we accept it.
No, I didn't ask you that. What I'm asking is, would you need to know absolutely everything that is required to be known about the creator or God to be able to know what the intrinsicness is of the creator, as you mentioned?
No.
You don't need to know.
No, you don't.
Okay, so does that mean that we are merely guessing as to what the creator is?
Well, I mean, there are some certain things, like by definition of, or by his essence, you can really deduce certain things, like he's all intelligent, all knowledgeable, all omnipotent, based on his creation. So it's sort
Excellent.
of induction.
Excellent. So Adam, are we also agreeing that we have only limited information about the creator?
Yes.
Okay. Does the scientific method and taking science as a whole, is that also limited?
Well, yeah, it is, and it's limited to the natural world. That's why
Excellent.
I disagree with Carlos. You know, I actually agree with you guys. I think I mentioned part of this before.
Excellent, excellent. That's fine. You see, if we were to, on a very basic level, I'm not going to go on the Einsteinian level like Brother Abbas and Brother Sabu do. We are going to keep it simple. A simple series of logical questions usually gives you a definitive answer. My view would be that for us to actually answer this question, can science prove God? We would have to necessarily know absolutely, which by definition we can't, absolutely everything about a creator to be able to even come up with a scientific test to be able to prove that there is a creator. However, having said that, I entirely agree with you. From an Islamic perspective, we are aware that there are so many, what I would consider to be signs that clearly establish for the thinking, reasonable individual to clearly establish the existence of a supreme being. That I can definitely agree. However, just going back before I stop about the question of can you conceive of something that is inconceivable? I'm just going to repeat that again for you. Can you think of something that cannot be thought of?
No.
Again, it's a contradiction.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I repeat the question again? Can you think of something that does not exist?
Well, that would no, because you can't think of nothing.
What is the definition of nothing scientifically?
Well, no, the answer is no, but
okay, right now.
Yeah.
So sorry, Adam, if I can just follow up. The thing that we hopefully the Creator willing, as I'm a Muslim, I have no problem in saying that. The issue about existence then comes into play. If I cannot think of something that does not exist, how can I think of a creator? Obviously, we can also say, how can I think of a unicorn, a favorite with our atheist friends?
Yeah, well, it
But it
just
is
means that it could exist, right? So, like,
excellent, excellent.
yeah.
That's
So
the
anything
point.
you-
Could exist. So we would have to necessarily look at the evidence to establish certain things. However, as a final sentence, I would say this: we would necessarily and logically require information from the creator to establish how the creator actually exists. Do you agree with that?
Well, beside, yeah, to know about his qualities other than the basic qualities that we can deduce from his existence, like
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So from my perspective, I would say this: yes, the scientific method is an excellent tool to establish certain facts, but I would venture to suggest that if we want to use the scientific method to be able to prove a creator, we are possibly doing what I would consider, or in Urdu they say, na idhar ka na udhar ka na ghar ka na ghat ka, or in an atheistic perspective, it is between the wife and the mistress. Obviously, because we may be dealing with issues of morality, they don't really come into play. But it would mean necessarily that if we don't have a certain amount of information about a creator from the creator, we will continually be confused.
Yeah, and I just wanted to, like, so the main contention here is with Carlos when his statement that, and I do agree with Abbas that they would, if there is a natural explanation, no matter how absurd, they would resort to it to explain the phenomenon, like the prayer, with the prayer example, or they would just say, or they don't know. So that, and science has no issue. Like, I'm a student of science, specifically physics. We have no issue with saying we don't know. That's the whole idea, is that of progression, is that you have to not know certain things for science to progress. So Carlos, they wouldn't resort, it wouldn't even prove or even indicate the supernatural from a scientific point of view. Actually, it would just lead to more questions in the future. So I don't want to see if you
Can I respond? Can I respond?
Yeah, of course. No. I mean, it's a free sort of floor.
Cool. Yeah. So, science isn't going to use supernatural explanations if it proves that prayer is that the power of prayer works. It's not going to do that. I agree. So there's no contention there. But the only reason that I'm saying that is the case is because in science, no supernatural claims have ever been verified, and that's the reason why they wouldn't go to a supernatural explanation if an example like Abbas's example of prayer working. It is a problem for theists because obviously you're trying to substantiate your claim, and even if you prove that prayer works, science will probably try and point to the unknown natural as an explanation rather than what you're claiming is the supernatural. So I agree with that, and that is a problem for theists in that sense. I think that if science could prove the supernatural claims or even prove the existence of God, then I think theists would revel in that because it would cement their beliefs in reality. But obviously science is the practice of distinguishing things that are real from things that can be argued as just imaginary, so
yeah. So just before we get the other perspectives, I'd like to bring in Johnson, who is an atheist, and then just get his perspective on what Carlos and others have been saying. Welcome, Johnson, to Scdawah Live.
Thank you. I've followed the stream as best as I can, and I've just got my own thoughts really. Certainly, the question is, can science prove God? I would say it can neither prove nor disprove, because there's not been any evidence so far to suggest that God has interacted with the world, with the cosmos in a manner that is clear. So you could talk about revelations, but they are ambiguous in a way; they're not definitive. So once you exclude those, then you have some supernatural being that exists outside of time and space, and science can only deal with the time and space. So if there is a being that's outside of that and it chooses to stay outside of that, then science can't identify it or find evidence of it at science's current limits. So the question is, can science prove it? I'd say no to both.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. I'd like to bring in whoever wants to, Sadat, Shabir, Abbas, whoever wants to comment on that.
I'd just like to comment on what Carlos said, you see. First of all, Carlos, I think, to be honest, you misunderstand the Muslim position of prayer. So we don't actually believe that just because you pray that you will see the response from God of accepting that prayer and benefiting you necessarily in this world. So Allah says that, for example, there may be things that you ask for here, but Allah will rather give it to you in the hereafter, because the benefit of those things will be far better in the hereafter. And at times you may ask for things that with your limited wisdom may actually be harmful for you. So that's the first thing, I think. I think that the second thing is that you mentioned that this is a problem for theists. Theists are not claiming that you can prove God or the metaphysical through science. We're not claiming that. The problem is, you see, your assumption rather is that if it exists, i.e. the metaphysical, that somehow science should be able to discover it, and the fact that it hasn't means that probably the metaphysical doesn't exist. But really that's a problem with atheists, not with the people of religion, because actually we're not making that claim. That is your assumption, and we're actually telling you that your assumption is wrong. And I think the other brother who just jumped in there, was it Brother Johnson? I'm sorry if I get the name wrong. Who agreed that yes,
Johnson.
Yeah, so that science is not there. Science's tool, as it were, its toolbox lacks the very tools in there to be able to even talk about the metaphysical. In Islam, for example, our golden age of science and what have you, the Muslims, though they were very practicing, they didn't say, oh, well, the clouds come here and it starts raining, that's just a miracle. No, they looked at certain verses in the Quran that alluded to these things, and they did lots of experiments and lots of observations and lots of, writings and calculations and all sorts of things to better understand those things. But I think that you keep saying
they got those answers through science.
Sorry?
They got those answers through science. If you're saying that they did it through experiments, yes. So
yeah, of course. But for them, what happened was that the Quran actually encourage the human beings to explore, to look at, to contemplate. Knowledge was something, and Allah says in the Quran, for example, the one learned and the one who is not learned are not equal. In other words, learning and exploring is something that is very much driven and pushed by the Quran to Muslims to do. And of course, so they didn't learn about the natural world necessarily from looking at the Quran. They did it through doing science. But we see science as a blessing, something that is very compatible with our religion. We don't have this history of scientists being burnt on the stake and because they were contradicting what we thought was in the Quran, for example. We don't have this history. So I think these are some of the misconceptions.
No, okay, but that's very cool. I mean, I wasn't, and that's you've talked about things that are entirely separate. So yes, Islam can promote science, and it has in many good ways, but that's entirely separate from the discussion of whether science can prove or disprove God, because you can have lots of earthly philosophies that are pro-science as well. So
yeah, thank you for that perspective, Johnson and Abbas. I'd like to bring in Shabir's perspective on what Carlos was saying and what Johnson was saying, and Sadat as well. We're coming close to the 2-hour mark, so I don't think we'll be allowing more guests in. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot there for everybody to comment on, I think, right now.
You know what? To be honest with you, I was hearing what Brother Carlos was saying, but what Brother Johnson said was actually tickling my mind. You see, you know, when we say, and I'll touch on what he says, hopefully, yeah, to Brother Johnson. You see, when you say, look, science can neither prove nor disprove. Again, I would suggest kindly that perhaps we need to reconsider how we are actually using the very word science. Can I ask you, Brother Johnson, what is actually originally the definition of the word science?
From my opinion, from my knowledge, science is just the collection of practices that identify, approximate. It's the best approximation for the truth. It uses experiments that are important. That it's testable and it's repeatable, and it can be done by other people who can analyze your results. They can repeat your tests, see if they come up with right results as well. And science is updated with better science, so we always get closer to the time with as more science is done. So that's
right.
what I think it is. And
sorry, Johnson.
About,
Sorry, Johnson. Your mic is breaking up. Can you just check the connector? So, because there's a lot of interference. Just like
okay, I'm talking on I have Bluetooth headphones, so hopefully it should. Is it better now?
It's the same, but it could be the headphones. Could you try your speaker instead of using the headphones?
Okay, if you mute me, I'll just come off.
Sure, yeah. So Shabir, maybe if you can also.
Yeah, right, not a problem. I was just telling Johnson. You see, Johnson, thank you very much. But that was an explanation you gave me from what you know. What I had asked is actually what science actually was defined as.
Is that any better?
That is excellent. We can hear you now clearly. Anyway, as I was saying, you see, you gave me a very good explanation. Thank you for that. But what I had asked was what the word science actually originally meant. And if you look at it, it actually merely means knowledge. Now, if we were to take the word knowledge, would that encompass pretty much everything that we know and possibly what we can conceive of?
Johnson? Not absolutely everything that we know, because it's but it's closest to approximating the truth than any other method that we're aware of.
Okay. Right, excellent. But just touching on what Brother Abbas was saying earlier on, would we consider metaphysics as knowledge?
No, because I don't think metaphysics is any particular real science, because nothing metaphysical has ever been found or proven. In the past, can I say, in the past, anything that used to be thought of as metaphysical has been found out to be physical and natural in the end. So lightning, meteor strikes, all of these were thought to be metaphysical. Now they're known to be physical.
No, I don't have a problem with that. What I asked you, Johnson, respectfully, is the word knowledge, would that encompass metaphysics?
In my opinion, no, because I don't think of anything metaphysical. Though,
okay,
No,
not at all. You see, if you don't consider metaphysics as knowledge, where would you draw the line for knowledge?
Where do I draw the line? Well, there's, principally scientific knowledge, and.
Sorry. I do apologize for interjecting, Johnson. When you use the word scientific, I'm considering it to mean knowledge.
Yes. So scientific knowledge.
Okay. So no. The word science is knowledge. I'm saying the word knowledge encompasses everything that we can conceive of, and that would include metaphysics. Are you saying metaphysics is not knowledge?
I'm saying I'm not aware of anything metaphysical, so I will exclude it unless you can find a way for putting it in.
So in metaphysics, it's not necessarily something which, like you're mentioning, like it's just anything that's beyond the natural world. So and that cannot be proven empirically. For instance, morality falls under metaphysics. It's actually a branch of philosophy. So yes, morality, you wouldn't claim that morality is not a form of knowledge, right? So you do accept certain truths that are metaphysical. Maybe you're not aware that you do, but so no, yeah. So knowledge encompasses beyond things beyond scientific knowledge. For instance, beliefs.
Sure.
If you read any philosophy, you would know that, or epistemology, you would know that majority of the philosophers have considered belief as a form of knowledge, but the reliability of a belief determines how likely that knowledge is to be true. So if you have reasons or evidence for your belief, then then it's knowledge.
I'm sorry, who is this speaking? Sorry?
Adam.
Adam, thank you so much. Brother Johnson, back to you. Are you now still insisting that metaphysics is not knowledge?
Well, I mean, he mentioned morality. I think you can have a scientific basis for morality, but really, he talks about metaphysics. I've not really known of any other. I'm not aware of anything else that's consistently metaphysical. He mentioned morality, and I think there's a big scientific basis for that. So if you can mention something else, and let's have a think. That's metaphysical.
Right, Johnson. So I do apologize, Brother Sabur. Johnson, is that an affirmative answer that yes, you may have been mistaken, but metaphysics is potentially a branch of knowledge?
It's potentially, but I'm trying. I can't find of anything that is particularly metaphysical. I mean, it's talking about
consciousness.
Okay, consciousness is a physical property of an advanced brain.
Sorry, what was that? Did you just say it's a physical property?
Consciousness is a property of an advanced brain. So
no. You said a physical property, Johnson.
Yes. So when a brain is
you have made an incredible discovery. How did you do that?
Okay. Well, just
are you going to retract?
No, I'll try and explain if you let me.
Excellent. Go ahead.
Consciousness is a function of an advanced brain, and neuroscience has shown from various experiments that when you do, you can alter someone's consciousness with medication, surgery. So these types of things show that it's amenable to testing and to the scientific process.
Johnson, what you are telling me is what you consider, or science or neuroscientists consider, to be effects. What is consciousness?
Consciousness is the ability of, I'd say, I mean, I can just look up the exact.
Please do, but remember, you did say you did say
sentient awareness of internal or external existence. Yes.
What does that mean? What is
consciousness?
Yes. Remember what you said. You respectfully, I'm not trying to hound you. I'm just trying to push the point home here. You said something, and you said there was evidence and proof for it. Now, are you still holding to that, or are you going to retract?
Okay.
Because you see, there are things. For example, not a problem. What we'll do, we'll just carry on. I do apologize, Brother Subur. Just a quick point. You see, if I were to use another example with you, Johnson, yes, I am stood next to a body. It's dead.
Okay.
What is the difference between the dead body and me?
Obviously, the dead body is no longer alive, so it's not it's not transforming the stored energy into different forms of energy, and it is no longer able to think or function.
Okay, excellent. What's the difference on an atomic level between the dead body and me?
The difference between you, I'd say, with you being alive, your body would be expounding energy to maintain your current state, and the dead body obviously isn't.
What is the difference between us on an atomic level? Are you there?
He's googling.
If you maybe
Sorry, Sabu, move on.
No. If you I mean, what I wanted to bring in is the idea that you were alluding to, is that metaphysics not being a branch of knowledge. The thing is, even if you're a hardcore naturalist, right, and you just believe the only thing that exists is physical matter and processes, you still have to accept that the world is real, and that other minds exist. You hold certain views about mathematics. So all of these things are essentially metaphysical. And even the idea that knowledge is, how do you construct, a worldview of knowledge, right? You have to do it within a metaphysical framework. So it's kind of inescapable, kind of what you were alluding to earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. If I can just add to that, Brother Sabu, you see, a lot of the time, a lot of our brethren in humanity will hold on to something. I mean, the theist, I'm quite uncomfortable with these particular words, but the theist is always accused of being the God of the gaps sort of individual. Yet, when we come across issues which, according to the common understanding, science does not have an answer for it, we gladly say we don't know. The issue is not about not knowing. If you can also gladly say you don't know, then you must be definitively open to the possibility that you may have got the wrong end of the stick and that there is a creator. But it is when it is totally shut off and they automatically assume that whatever knowledge is required to actually establish the certainty about whether there is a creator or not has actually been reached. And in 99% of the cases, it has not been reached. I finish. Sorry.
We've lost Johnson, but I think to wrap up, we'll start with Abbas, then Sadat, Yusuf, yourself, and any concluding thoughts from Adam and Carlos would also be most welcome. In fact, let's start with our guests first. So, Adam, your thoughts to wrap up the show today.
Oh yeah, I mean, Johnson made a grave, he has a grave misunderstanding. Like, even the most hardcore atheistic philosophers agree that metaphysics is a branch of knowledge, and that beliefs, that justified beliefs, are also a form of knowledge, not as reliable as other forms of knowledge per se, like on a purely epistemological basis. And I'm sure Yusuf knows this, and you guys as well. But yeah, I mean, there are definitely truths beyond science, unless you are a naturalist, which then there are flaws with that too. I just wanted to say that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Carlos, your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, man. So science, because there's so many, what I think is infinite ways to explain things that happen in reality, like science tends to rule out more things than it actually proves. So, like, if you take another supernatural claim, like water dowsing, like people who use a stick to try and find water, that's a supernatural claim, or it would be treated as a supernatural claim because it's not yet been verified. But we can use a scientific method to prove that water dowsing doesn't work, and therefore it gets ruled out. You can also look at a young Earth creationist who believes that the Earth is 6,000 years old, and that humans lived alongside dinosaurs. Science has ruled that out. So if you hold that position, it doesn't hold any weight. So science does tend to rule out more things than it proves. And obviously, like I said before, because only natural claims have only ever been verified, it will only use those as a basis to come to a reasonable conclusion when we deal with something that's unknown, or we're dealing with the unknown. So, that's why I'm saying it's always going to be difficult for theists to make a case that something is, linked to God, I don't necessarily understand about how prayer works under Islam. So, to Abbas, I don't know if I probably got that wrong there, or my understanding of prayer from an Islamic perspective is wrong, and maybe I'm applying it to Christianity or something else potentially. But I'm obviously just talking in a general sense, because I put all religions in the same category of making supernatural claims that exist in the natural world, and therefore, in my view, those claims, whilst they won't necessarily prove God or disprove God, we can definitely disprove or rule out those specific claims using science, and do it quite convincingly. And that's why, again, like I say, if you're a young Earth creationist and you still hold to that position, you'll just be thrown out. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, Carlos, for that. And we'll go from the bottom up. So, Yusuf, if you could give your concluding remarks today, and maybe some of your thoughts on what Carlos said.
Yeah. So sorry as well. It's a bit of a nightmare with the daughter. Every time I try to leave, she'd wake up. But yeah. So obviously, I've missed quite a lot of what's been happening. In terms of, so I'll just kind of touch on the prayer thing. I'm guessing it's related to some of the experiments where they tried to figure out the success rate with prayers. And with regards to that, I'd like to mention how being observed can fundamentally affect the intention, or the person that's doing a deed in general. I think in sociology is like a known principle that people act differently when they know they're being observed, when they know that scientists are checking and doing this and that and the other. And so when it comes to trying to observe prayers, the act of trying to actually document all of this itself might affect the prayers themselves. So if someone's praying for a family member, and this kind of idea that there's a scientist there watching, and they're hoping that it might actually improve the chances of this person surviving or anything like that, that sometimes might actually be overrid by the desire to sort of prove that your religion is right, or things like that. So that there was an example where there was certain miracles that were happening with Aisha radiallahu anha, and she had like a bag of flour or something, and it was just never going down, and they kept using it, and eventually it got to a point where it's like, it's getting ridiculous now. We've had this flour for ages. Why is it not going down? And so then when they tried to measure it, the miracle stopped, and then eventually it went down after that point. And so this kind of touches on this idea that miracles, prayers being answered, these kind of things, obviously the scientists or people that really want to kind of be able to document this explicitly are not going to like this. But I think trying to measure these things, or trying to document them in an explicit way, might have a negative effect on it. And then I think there's very good reasons for that as well, in the sense that there's supposed to be an element of mystery surrounding these things, and that's kind of what adds to their beauty. And secondly, the other thing that I wanted to kind of touch on, what was it that Carlos mentioned again, other than the prayer thing?
Carlos,
dinosaurs on the ark, I think, which we also don't believe. So just thought.
Oh yeah. Sorry, the other thing that you mentioned. Yeah. So in terms of
water dowsing,
I don't know what that is. What's that?
Where you use a certain stick to try and find water or locate water. I think that was a practice that people believed that existed. That was the only other example I think I used.
Yeah, we don't believe in that either.
Yeah, no. But with regards to prayers as well, I think Islamically, we don't even necessarily believe that it's only the Muslims whose prayers are answered. So it might very well be that other religious people, or even atheists in certain cases, they might turn to God in a moment of need, and beg for something, and then God willing, He'd answer that prayer. So it's not strictly, you know, for example, there's two names, Abdurrahman and Ar-Rahim, which is two forms of God's mercy, and one of those mercies is all-encompassing, so that it encompasses the believers and the disbelievers as well. And you know, this mercy would also kind of encompass the idea of answering prayers or answering requests of people. But yeah, I think the biggest issue is just this idea of trying to document something is itself going to affect it. And there's a similar problem that pops up in quantum mechanics as well, the double slit experiment. Every time they try to make an observation, that has a huge effect on the experiment itself. And I think the same probably applies to things like prayer. And personally, I don't have any issue with that. But obviously, certain people that need or demand that this must have conclusive results and must show, you know, they're never going to be happy without the answers being documented explicitly. But yeah, I don't really know too much more about what I could say on the matter other than that.
Jazakallah khair for that, Yusuf. Johnson, his line dropped earlier, so we're just wrapping up. Could you give your concluding remarks before we move on to the rest of the panelists?
So yeah, thanks for letting me back on after my connection lost. So yeah, my conclusion based on listening to what I have listened to is that I'm still not finding anything supernatural outside of science. So I can't find any evidence for any supernatural being. So I think the best thing to do is just to withhold belief in any supernatural being until there's any evidence or sufficient evidence for it. So that would be my conclusion.
Jazakallah khair. Not Jazakallah khair, that's a different term, but thank you for that. Next is Sadat. Could you give your thoughts on what Johnson said and your concluding remarks?
Yeah, so to repeat what I said earlier on, I would say that strictly speaking, science cannot directly, empirically demonstrate the existence of God. Yes, cumulatively, we could take a lot of kind of evidential stuff and infer from that there has to be a creator. But at the same time, I mean, I want to make it clear that this should not be seen as some kind of shortcoming on the part of religion or Islam. When I say that science cannot directly demonstrate the existence of God, this is not a shortcoming, because if we all reflect on, first of all, our own consciousness, if we reflect on the fact that we believe in other conscious beings, if we reflect on the fact that we all have experienced love, hate, anger, beauty, ugliness, the most interesting things of the human experience actually happen outside of the scientific realm. And I'm sure, you know, Johnson would agree, or was it Carlos? If they reflect on that some of the most interesting things in the human experience actually happen outside of the empirical realm, and there are things that you cannot demonstrate, yet we believe them to be true.
Well,
I'll just repeat something
at this moment, but they could be with future scientific discoveries, because a lot of cognitive neuroscience is looking at emotions, as you're mentioning. So I wouldn't say
sorry, Johnson and Sadat. That point, Johnson, was actually addressed a bit earlier in the live stream, but because we're wrapping up, if we could just because we're already 20 minutes over roughly.
So yeah, I mean, this is kind of what atheists will do. Then they will just fill in that blank with the science of the gaps, right? They'll fill it in with the science of the gaps, that okay, science will, although it's never happened, science has never explained or proven consciousness. Science can't prove that I'm a conscious being, but this will one day happen, because we have this blind faith in science being able to one day step outside of its domain, step outside of its purview, overcome its own methodological restrictions, and prove something of an entirely different realm, which is the metaphysical. So this is what I call the science of the gaps. And obviously we're not going to restart like a back and forth, so I'll just put it in a general way and not point it at not direct it towards any one person. But I would ask atheists out there, for example, have you ever known a beautiful woman? Right? Most people will say yes. Okay, but how did you know that she's beautiful, right? How would you empirically prove or demonstrate that she was beautiful? Nowadays, how would you empirically prove or demonstrate she's a woman? You could even bring it to that. So there's a lot of things like this that come down to intuitive belief. And I'll just end by saying that if you do believe in your own consciousness, if you do believe in the depth of time, in chronology, that yesterday really did exist, that means that every atheist, every naturalist is primarily a believer. When I say a believer, I don't mean in the Quranic sense, in the sense of one who attests to Tawheed and the belief in the Creator. But if you believe in reality, if you believe that what you're experiencing right now is reality, that this live stream is occurring in reality and not in a dream, then by default, you are a believer first. You operate on intuitive belief first, and then you start going into your arguments for why God doesn't exist.
Jazakallah khair for that, Brother Sadat. Next is Abbas. You actually muted.
It's a good thing because I just coughed. See, the problem with atheists is that they say, because I haven't found empirical evidence, I'm not going to believe in the metaphysical. The people of religion are not claiming that you will be able to discover the metaphysical from the scientific method, because the scientific method has an underpinning axiom, which is that everything can be explained naturalistically. And if there isn't a naturalistic explanation, that explanation will one day come in the future. So it's a preposterous argument. It's a fallacious argument. And it's because we're not arguing that, you see. That's the first point. The second point is when we say, oh, I only believe in things because they're empirically provable or they're scientifically provable, in reality, that's a lie. You know, I believe in my parents being my parents, not because I did a DNA test, but I have reasons to believe, whether it's because I look like my dad or because people have told me that, yes, you were born on this date or whatever it might be. Do I believe that Shakespeare exists? Or yes, because there's some writings and people have said that these were from Shakespeare. And much of what we believe is because of testimony, valid testimony, especially if it's multiple, ending up in multiple parts of the world. We base our opinions on things on what's called balance of probability. How likely is this to be true as opposed to being false, for example? So this whole notion, this straw man that things are only believed and accepted because of empiricism is an absolute, I'm sorry to say, it's a lie, because that's not how we operate our lives. And I think we should be consistent about that. And we should recognize that much of our knowledge actually comes from these different facets of evidences, reasons, and probabilities as to why we accept certain things. And that's exactly the argument that the theist is making, and certainly that I make, which is that if you read the Quran and you analyze the Quran, on balance of probability, I don't believe you can come up with any other conclusion that this had to be from something far superior to any human capability or capacity. Now, that's a place that I've arrived at based upon the analysis of the Quran. Can I prove that with empiricism? No, I can't do that. But I can't prove much of what I believe with empiricism. Just, for example, the world being spherical. Yes, I've seen photos, but they could be doctored. People have been up in space. Yes, but the lenses on the windows could have been round, and that's why they saw the Earth round. I could believe in all the conspiracy theories, or I could operate a balance of probability. How likely is it that the world is flat, to how likely is it that all those observations, all those different testimonies, all those different witnesses are all lying to me? So I'm pretty convinced that yes, that the world is probably spherical. But much of our knowledge is dependent upon that and not empiricism. So please just be honest with your arguments.
Yeah, absolutely. Jazakallah khair for that. And I'm definitely going to remember the example of prayer being explained by quantum entanglement, because that's a very common atheistic argument, and that I mean, that's actually in the God delusion as well. So that's a brilliant answer to that as well for those who missed out on what Abbas was saying earlier. Jazakallah khair. Next is Shabir.
How can we beat what Brother Abbas just said? No chance. But I will try, inshallah. Yeah, look, you know what? If we just start from the basics, we are born. If I were to ask what is the definition of life, we will get at least 50 plus definitions. If that is not enough, you have Gerald Joyce of NASA. He says, life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. I'll leave that to Brother Sabur. You will have over 100 definitions of life. What is the definition of death? We all know. It is a cessation of all kinds of activities within the body. But if we go down to the atomic level, we find that not to be the case. And I would say, just to add to what Brother Abbas said, if you look at life, all the nuances of life, you will have all the necessary evidence for a creator's existence. You just need to look at the right places, and that is an effort in itself. But one thing I would say, and this is not in any way casting aspersions on our atheistic fraternity, but my contention has been and will be, until I am proven otherwise, that atheism is an advanced form of ignorance and delusion. Now, this is not trying to offend them. This is saying, if you look at the word ignorance and delusion, you will find it ties the atheist to a T. And I would kindly suggest to our atheistic fraternity to actually consider evidence other than what you would call the scientific method. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair, everybody, for giving your thoughts on this very important topic. We have another live stream just about to go live on EF Dawah. And Brother Abbas, would you just like to just very quickly summarize what that's about?
Yeah, so they're basically, mashallah, on EF Dawah, we're going through the entire gospel. They've been through, pretty much all the Gospels, and today it's the Second Timothy, and they're going to be discussing Paul's letters. And they're methodically going through all the Gospels. And mashallah, I mean, I'm not on that on that show because I'm not really capable of those arguments. But mashallah, Brother Hamza, Brother Nazim, Brother Sadat, mashallah, will go from here. I think he's already gone to
He's gone.
And Brother Ijaz, and the Dr. Imran, they'll all be on that stream, inshallah. So that's on EF Dawah. So yeah, do come and join us there, inshallah. After
why don't we gate crash them, eh? Gate crash.
like I did here.
Use science to disprove Timothy too.
Exactly.
All right, everybody, Jazakallah khair. May Allah bless you all, and thank you for watching Scdawah live. We will be live again next week at the same time.
Brothers, listen, Brother Sabur, I do apologize interjecting. Look, guys, inshallah, when this lockdown is over, I want us to set a date where I'm inviting all of you to a barbecue, and I can guarantee you I make the best in the world.
I'm up for that. I need a bit of socializing in my life. I've not had any in a while.
Definitely, inshallah. That's a promise.
Brother Shabir, are you inviting all the viewers as well? Because it sure sounds like that.
Not a problem at all. They can all come as long as they bring the chicken with them.
Okay, Jazakallah khair, brothers. We do need to wrap up. Guys who are watching, please do pop over to EF Dawah where you can join. I think if Abbas is not going to be on there, but the other brothers are on there. May Allah bless them all. Okay, Jazakallah khair for all of you joining. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.